Good evening here from Portugal. First of all, I would like to thank very much the organizing committee for having me here. For me, it has been extremely important to get to know more in depth about the Wikidata community. I'm just a beginner in this area, in this sector. So the aim of my presentation is in a way to engage in a broader dialogue with the Wikidata community, is to reflect upon the relevance of copyright and open access in the future preservation of our contemporary cultural heritage, especially considering mostly those works that are placed in between music and visual arts, those that I'm currently studying. Well, I did not present it myself. My name is Andreia Nogueira, and I'm interested in this subject because this connects with my professional and academic path. I'm a contemporary art conservator with a PhD in conservation and restoration of cultural heritage, awarded by the Nova University of Lisbon. At the moment, I'm engaged in critical and reflexive work on the meaning and significance of our contemporary cultural heritage in between music and visual arts, and on the articulation between sustainable development and creative conservation, and in the way that they intersect with the issues of open access and the copyright. And later on, I will explain more in depth how these issues connect to each other. Currently, I'm conducting the project Art in Between, Bridging the Gap for the Long-Term Sustainability of Multimedia Artworks in Between Music and Visual Arts. Hosted at TechniArt is the Research Center for Technology, Restoration and Arts Enhancement from the Instituto Politécnico de Tomar here in Portugal. So I'm much interested in fostering my knowledge about Wikidata and has to propose and develop a more sustainable, creative and dynamic way to provide open access to the documentation produced by conservators, curators, registrars, composers, interpreters, among many others. The fact is that since the inception of the ready-made, any and every material started to be used as a vehicle of the artistic discourse. With the adoption of ephemeral materials such as chocolate, water, wine, sound, among many others, along with increasing dependence on digital technology and performative events, new challenges came to the fore, considering the future of works created especially within the domains of conceptual art, installation art, performance art, time-based media, new media art, net art, as well as considering, for example, the preservation of electroacoustic music, computer music, live electronic music, and so on. So given these works' dependence, performative dependence, it is the quality of the documentation produced, often by museum professionals such as conservators, curators, among many others, sometimes even artists, composers, the audience itself in a participatory practice. So is the quality of the documentation produced by these agents that will determine the long-term sustainability of these works. So in other words, as I have here in my slide, no one talks about researchers, teaches or exhibits, presents multimedia works or other sorts of artistic creations, especially those performance-based, intangible, ephemeral, or born digital, that are not preserved through documentation simply because they disappear. And this happens firstly because most of these works do not have necessarily any material support with which to enter into dialogue. And secondly, for our memory is volatile and precarious, hence the need for the establishment of a musical notation or the sorts of documentation capable of materializing the material, allowing artworks to pass on from the past to the present and the future. Actually, much has been said about the importance of the production of a proper documentation, with several projects developed on the subject, starting mostly by the 19th, both in the areas of the preservation, considering the visual arts and music. I listed here a very few. And a lot of much has been said as well about the relevance of getting access to the documentation produced in order to implement casuistry based in a comparative assessment of previous decisions and case studies. In fact, when confronted with the moral problem, for example, casuistry first looks into similar cases instead of applying general rules or principles. It proceeds via comparison and analogy. Philosopher Nevan Val is well known in the field of contemporary art conservation for first proposing the implementation of the casuist method to conservation decision making. She suggests that attention should be paid on how principles have been applied in paradigmatic case studies to arrive at appropriate decisions. For that reason, decision-making reasoning has to be or should be documented, with this documentation being shared and made available in a way that others will have this information for other decision-making processes. Most documentation has, however, not been made available in open access, as it would be preferable, primarily due to copyright issues. And part of the one that is freely available is starting to get lost, since digital or online repositories are ceasing to be maintained after the end of their funding projects. For I will give here the example of Sydney. In this case, this database was created within the working group Collaborative Archiving and Creative Preservation. And this database is used nowadays to preserve, and this working group was created during 2018 and 2019, so it's very recent. And this database is used to preserve the contemporary musical repertoire created at IRCAM, which is the Institut de Recherche et Coordination Acoustique Musique in France, and this is one of the most important research centers engaged in productive interaction among scientific research, technological developments, and contemporary music production. And this database is used on a daily basis to document pieces and also to retrieve the information when someone wants to perform a piece or needs additional information for a decision-making process in similar cases or other works. Sydney is a database with a web interface, which is part of the Brahms website. And this Brahms website is also a public database with information on contemporary music. But, for example, the signal part is a kind of hidden part of this database, which is only accessible inside IRCAM. According to Serge Lemonton, one of the coordinators of the database, it is not possible to put everything in open access due to legal issues. We can find in this database a lot of different files, such as, for example, published scores, recordings from musicians, patch files, commercial software. So there are a lot of different elements which depend on different kind of property rights. This demonstrates that it is still necessary to further investigate whether or not, or how to put this information in open access, if possible at all, bearing in mind European and international relevant legislation. The digital cultural heritage, in this case, I think would be important to make a reference here to the Digital Cultural Heritage Research Group from DICOM Italy, for instance. And this group has recently released this publication about facts, authors' rights, copyright and open access licenses for culture and the web. This publication have more or less response to 100 questions and answers for museums, archives, and libraries. This publication has practical indications for museums, archives, and libraries with the aim of clarifying the opportunities and legal limits related to the reuse and dissemination of digital reproduction of cultural resources on the web. We need, however, to get even further and to think and propose new policy recommendations or to try to find new pathways into open access as to reach a much more sustainable preservation practice of contemporary art, in this case music included. And this is of the utmost importance because due to this lack of open access, the information is not reaching the overall stakeholders community and hence not getting the advantage of a collaborative or participatory practice of maintenance, which is extremely important if we consider as well that a lot of online repositories or databases are starting to disappear due to the unavailability of permanent human resources. And here I would like to return to the working group on collaborative archiving and creative preservation, because I think that this quote is very interesting because it is a quite long quote, but it goes, I think, in my opinion, goes into the heart of the question. And this is a thought about Sergio from Sergio Lemonton, and according to him, the thing is that to preserve digital data, you need to give some energy. I mean, if you unplug the server or if you don't give enough human resources, permanent human resources to preserve the repository, it will disappear, it will die. That's something we have also observed in this context, because since the beginning of the 21st century, there have been a lot of initiatives to preserve electroacoustic music, for instance, or electroacoustic music or music mist, and a lot of these projects were financed for a certain amount of time, and after the end of the project, it disappeared. So even on internet, we can find a lot of repositories, but as they are not maintained, they disappear. So they start to make a kind of symmetry of their projects, and are quite a lot. So we are trying to think about what I call meta-preservation, which means that we want to preserve not only the content of what we want to preserve, but also the container. So we want to preserve the preservation project itself. And that's also something we have learned from previous experiments. You can give a lot of energy to a project, but if you don't think about the preservation of the project itself, it will disappear. And what you have done is done for nothing. For me, this seems extremely dramatic, but in a way realistic. And I think it is time to look more seriously about this problem of having a lot of online repositories or databases that are not being maintained. Considering here the example, one example in the area of the preservation practices applied to contemporary artworks in the field of visual arts, we are also witnessing this scenario, not just in the area of music, of contemporary music, but also in the visual arts. I will give here the example of the Inside Installation project, an extremely important project dedicated to the preservation and presentation of installation art, which took place between 2004 and 2007. 25 museums and institutions located in 6 European countries have been involved in this 3-year project, which was funded by the European Commission. 33 case studies of installation works of art, mostly dating from 1995 and 2005, have profoundly been researched and reinstalled. They raised a wide range of questions and asked for specific approaches. At the same time, in-depth research has been carried out on the following 5 areas: preservation, artists' participation, documentation strategies, theory and semantics, and knowledge management and information exchange. Case studies results, recorded lectures, and good practices in all research areas used to be accessible via the project website, in this website, which includes sections for project information, lectures presented during workshops, articles, guidelines, and other outcomes of the research activities. A special area is dedicated to the 33 case studies, aim to provide extensive information on the research and installation of these works of art. And this is the main page in this section about the case studies. Unfortunately, let's back to this slide. Unfortunately, if we, as you can see here in this slide here, if we click on in one of these names of the case studies, the information could not be retrieved anymore, as the page does not exist anymore as well. The Inside Installation Project's website is currently powered by the Wayback Machine, which is an initiative of the Internet Archive, a non-profit organization that is building a digital library of internet sites and other cultural artifacts in digital form, like a paper library. It provides free access to researchers, historians, scholars, and the general public. Its mission is to provide universal access to all knowledge. But as we can see here, we cannot have access to the information anymore even using this Wayback Machine. And I have to say here as well that we have in Portugal an initiative from the national agency, the National Funding Agency for Science and Technology, which has also a platform on internet that is used to retrieve and to preserve, let's say, all the pages on the internet. And actually in that program as well, there is no information about this project of the Inside installations. So with this comes the question, why then to devote so many resources in getting artworks documented for their future preservation if that documentation is not always openly shared or maintained, and hence not known and available to the overall community of stakeholders? It is time to give more attention to issues around open access, copyright law, and authors' rights, as well as to the conservators' and curators' rights on the documentation they produce, as to reach a much more sustainable preservation practice of contemporary art. And for example, why not to consider a more recurring collaboration with the Wikidata community to foster the communication and dissemination of the documentation and information produced? We have already heard here in this event a lot very good examples. There is, however, a long journey has to use more recurring the Wikidata system particularly in this field of contemporary art. However, it is my belief that the collaboration with the Wikidata community could end in first, having more people using the information produced, which will give greater visibility to our work and to the artworks themselves. And in this way, we will also contribute to strengthening stakeholder sense of belonging through a continuous engagement with society and through better promotion practices. Second, could end in a much more sustainable practice of contemporary art in relation to management, communication, and maintenance of the produced documentation, providing for a future cultural identity much richer, embracive, inclusive, sustainable, and creative. Third, could end in getting a collaborative and participatory environment by having several editors working in various languages, which will lead as well to a much wider dissemination. And fourth, could end in contributing to better and well-informed decision-making processes. The aim of we have, of course, a long way in getting Wikidata evolve, has to accumulate the huge variety and the amount and type of documentation that we produce in this field of contemporary art. But the way forward, in my opinion, is working collaboratively. So the aim of my communication is, in a way, to get more involved with the Wikidata community. I'm just a beginner, as I said. Has to foster future collaborative work on new pathways towards the management and dissemination of the open data in contemporary art conservation studies. Not everything can be made accessible through open access, I know, but at least we should do our best to maintain and give the wider possible dissemination to open data. I would like to end with this thought, wrote by Marcel Proust. The real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes. In fact, to examine the future of the 21st century artistic creations in general, one needs new eyes, not to discover new landscapes, but to truly see what is there waiting to be brought to the fore. And in this case, I'm referring to the Wikidata community and the way it can be an extra aid in the development of sustainable, creative, and dynamic practices of open access in contemporary art and contemporary music preservation studies. So that's it. Thank you very much for your attention. So I do not know exactly the time. If I have some time for questions.
We have a minute for questions.
1 minute?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. So I think we'll not have here so many questions here. So.
Well, thank you so much, Andreia, for sharing your work and your contact information if anyone does want to reach out with questions or collaboration. And there's also a social room too if you'd like to interact there.